Good morning. I'm Stephen Leake. I'm an elder at First Presbyterian Church in Mesquite, Texas, and I'm also one of the teachers of the Discipleship Sunday School class there. Today we're continuing with our study of the Gospel of John. And today deals with the crucifixion of Jesus. I'd like to remind you that our curriculum is based upon the daily Bible study series by Professor William Barclay, and that we're using the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible for our scripture readings. We have 2 scripture readings today, so let's get started. We're in chapter 19, and our first scripture reading is verses 17 through 22. So they took Jesus, and carrying the cross by himself, he went out to what is called the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side, with Jesus between them. Pilate also had an inscription written and put on the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this inscription because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek. Then the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but this man said, 'I am King of the Jews.'" Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." Well, there was no more terrible death than death by crucifixion. It was originally a Persian method of execution. To the Persians, the soil was sacred, and they wished to avoid defiling it with evil blood. Crucifixion was never used in the homeland, only in the provinces, and only in the case of slaves. It was unthinkable that a Roman citizen should die such a death. So Jesus died the most dreaded death in the ancient world, the death of slaves and criminals. The routine of crucifixion was always the same. When the case had been heard and the criminal condemned, the judge uttered the fateful sentence, and the verdict was carried out right away. The condemned man carried his cross and was escorted by 4 Roman citizens. Whipping preceded the crucifixion, and often the criminal had to be lashed along the way. Before him walked an officer with a placard on which was written the crime. And there was a double reason for that. The first reason was that the placard might serve as a deterrent for anyone who might commit a similar crime. The second reason was that if anyone could still bear witness in his favor, he might come forward and do so. In Jerusalem, the place of execution was called the place of the skull. In Hebrew, Golgotha, and in Latin, Calvary. It was outside the city walls, for it was not lawful to execute a man within the boundaries of the city. One suggestion for its name was because it was littered with human skulls from previous executions. But that's not likely, because Jewish law required that bodies must all be buried by nightfall. It was probably named that because it was on a hill shaped like a skull. It was a grim place where grim things were done. Jesus went out bruised and bleeding, carrying his own cross to the place where he was to die. And there are 2 further things we must note. The inscription on Jesus' cross was in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. These were the 3 great languages of the ancient world. Every nation has something to teach the world. Greece taught the world beauty. Rome taught the world law. And the Hebrews taught the world religion and the worship of the one true God. The consummation of all these things is seen in Jesus Christ. In him was the supreme beauty, the law of God, and the very image of God. It was symbolic that the three great languages of the world should call him king. There's no doubt that Pilate put this inscription on the cross to irritate and annoy the Jews. The Jewish leaders repeatedly asked him to remove it, and Pilate refused. Here's Pilate the inflexible, the man who will not be moved. Just hours before, the same man had been bullied and blackmailed into executing Jesus. One of the paradoxical things in life is that we can be stubborn about things which do not matter and weak about things of supreme importance. Our second scripture reading today is chapter 19, verses 23 and 24. When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier. They also took his tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from the top. So they said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see who will get it." This was to fulfill what the scripture says. They divided my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots. Now, one of the perks for the escorting soldiers was the clothes of the victim. Every Jew wore 5 articles of apparel: his shoes, his turban, his girdle, his tunic, and his outer robe. There were 4 soldiers, and there were 5 articles of clothing. They threw dice for them, and each had his pick. John tells us the inner tunic was left over, so they threw the dice again. There are many things in this vivid picture. First, no picture shows the indifference of the world to Christ like this one. There on the cross, Jesus was dying in agony, and there at the foot of the cross, the soldiers threw their dice as if it did not matter. Second, Jesus' tunic is described as being without seam, woven in one piece from top to bottom. That is the precise description of the linen tunic which the high priest wore. So when John tells us of the seamless tunic of Jesus, it's not just a description of the kind of clothes that Jesus wore. It tells us that Jesus is the perfect priest, opening the way to God for all people. Third, we note that in this incident, John finds fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. He reads back into it the saying of the psalmist, "They divide my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots." That from Psalm 22, verse 18. Thanks for joining me again today. God bless each and every one of you.